Well, once you get all these texts and versions together, well, that then leads to the question of how do we fit everything together? And there is a hypothesis by William F. Albright, as also adopted by his student Frank Cross. It's a theory of local recension, in which he hypothesizes that you can divide up all this texts and versions of the Old Testament as follows. Hypothetically, you had the original text, the Ur-text, as they call it. But then they believe that that text was divided up into two major blocks: texts that stayed in Palestine and texts that were brought to Babylonia in the Babylonian exile. But then, under the texts that stay in Palestine, there are those texts that were brought to Egypt that become what one might call the Egyptian recension of the Old Testament. Uh, and that was the Hebrew text used by the translators of the Septuagint to produce the Septuagint text. And that's not unrelated to the text used by Lucian, Aquila, Theodotion, and older Latin translations pre Jerome, as well as Origen's Hexapla. Origen lived in Egypt, and he was influenced by this Egyptian recension of the text, which is related to the Septuagint. But then another branch of the Palestinian text is the Palestinian recension that is the precursor to the Samaritan Pentateuch. And so those are the two branches of the Palestinian text. But then on the Babylonian text side, the text that was brought to Babylon, well, that becomes the Babylonian recension in Albright's local recension theory. And there are a couple of branches of that. One branch became the Proto-Masoretic texts. Another branch influenced was used to translate the Targums. It was influenced by the Proto-Masoretic texts, but it's slightly different than Proto-Masoretic texts. And then the Proto-Masoretic text is used to form, first of all, the Masoretic text itself. So Proto-Masoretic text develops into the Masoretic text that we've mostly talked about as being used. It was a Proto-Masoretic text that was used to translate the Bible into Syriac, since the Masoretic text had not been developed at that time. So they used the Proto-Masoretic text. The Latin Vulgate is also a translation of the Proto-Masoretic text, though it's also influenced by the Septuagint. So whoever was Jerome, who was translating the Hebrew text, had his eye also on the Septuagint, and sometimes he's influenced by the Septuagint in the way that he renders things. And then, of course, as we've talked about already, the Masoretic texts came to be printed in the printed in the early Hebrew Bibles. It was also the basis of the oldest Hebrew texts, the Ben Asher texts, and it also influenced the Ben Naphtali texts, as was discussed earlier. And it leads to our critical editions of the Hebrew Bible, which are influenced by all of these things, but especially the Masoretic tradition, and especially B19A as the basis for the critical edition. So anyway, that's Albright's local recension theory. And if you can break up things in the schools of manuscript, Egyptian recension, Palestinian recension, Babylonian recension, well, then you can compare textual criticism by comparing these families of tradition. And that's, again, how they do things also in New Testament manuscripts. Well, when you get down to the bottom line, well, what kind of problems or errors do you find in the Hebrew Bible? Well, in all transmissions of text, you're likely to get the following sorts of things. You can get didography, writing one word or letter twice when it should have only been written once. You can omit words accidentally or omit letters accidentally. You can miswrite a word or a letter. You can write a homonym for a word rather than the word itself. We saw that in Isaiah 9, verse 2 or verse 3, depending on Hebrew English, where the word lo is spelled two different ways between the kare kativ. Well, somebody wrote an aleph which was a homonym when the aleph should not have been written. They might write a synonym and not the word itself. Those are all accidental errors. Then there are intentional errors when the scribe wrongly perceives there to be an error and corrects it. And that takes something that was correct and makes it wrong because the scribe misunderstood and thought it was wrong. Or you could improve a text. You didn't like the way it read, so you make it better. And in that case, the scribe is becoming an author or an editor rather than simply a scribe copying the received tradition. Now, there are rules of Old Testament textual criticism. The general rule is that the Masoretic text, and this is the consensus among Old Testament textual critics, the Masoretic text is generally the best text. And so, all things being equal, we tend to give the Masoretic text the benefit of the doubt. But when then should we correct the Masoretic text? Well, there are several times when it can happen. One, if it makes no sense. I mean, if it's just absolutely gobbledygook, well, then it's very likely that it's corrupt. And unlike the New Testament, where conjecture is almost never justified, conjecture is sometimes justified in places where the text looks hopelessly corrupt. If you have several texts and versions that agree against the Masoretic text, well, that can be a reason for suggesting that it should be corrected. Where a non-Masoretic reading best explains the origin of the extant readings, that too can be a basis for correcting the Masoretic text. Now, there are certain rules of textual criticism that are used in New Testament manuscripts that don't apply so much with the Old Testament. So, for example, in New Testament manuscripts, it's often said that the shorter reading is to be preferred, that the tendency was for scribes to add things. So Jesus may become Lord Jesus, and then the next scribe makes it Lord Jesus Christ, and so on and so forth. And that's a serviceable rule for the New Testament. Unfortunately, for the Old Testament, most of the variations are of the same length, so it doesn't really help you there. Another rule in New Testament textual criticism, the more difficult reading is to be preferred. It assumes that scribes tend to clarify if things are difficult or obscure. They tend to kind of fix things, clarify things. But in the Masoretic tradition, the only way we may know that there is a problem is that the text is difficult. And so that may be an indication of a problem rather than something to be preferred. And then, as we already mentioned, in the New Testament, you almost never resort to conjectural emendation. By that, we mean by saying, well, we don't have any manuscripts that are versions that say this, but almost surely the text is wrong and this is how we should fix it. Now, it applies well to the New Testament because we have so many manuscripts that one or another manuscript probably has the original reading. But the Old Testament is not so nearly richly attested as New Testament. And sometimes problems reflect our ignorance of the meaning of rare words. Uh, so you can be a little bit hesitant to change the text because maybe the text is right and it seems to be obscure because we've lost the meaning of a unusual word or an unusual meaning of a word. But in some cases, the earliest corruptions may have found their way into all the earliest attested texts, in which case the only way to fix the text is to use conjectural emendation. Not to be used often. It's kind of a last resort thing, but unlike the New Testament, occasionally it can be justified. Well, let's look at an example of a textual variant. And here I'll use Ruth chapter 1 and verse 1. And the Hebrew and the Greek is on the left, and the comments on the right. So the Masoretic text reads Bimei Shafot HaShofatim, in the days of the judging of the judges. But when you get to the Septuagint, it has a shorter reading implied. It says, Inte krinein tus kritas, which in Hebrew is bishpot ha-shofatim, when the judges judged, would be the rendering of it. In other words, it leaves out the word days in that particular reading. But then when you get to the Syriac translation, it implies a Hebrew text of Bimei HaShofatim, in the days of the judges. So you have three different variations: in the days of the judging of the judges, when the judges judged, and in the days of the judges. And so the question is, which is right? And the way that textual criticism tends to go is, well, which reading best explains the other readings? Well, if the Septuagint were original, we would have to ask the question, where did the Syriac and where did the Masoretic tradition get the word days of? And so the lack of days and two against one in those different traditions suggests that, well, Septuagint is probably not right because there's quite a bit of evidence for the word days being found in the text. But then you can ask, well, could the Syriac be original? Well, if the Syriac is original, well, how did both the Septuagint and the Masoretic texts get the word judging in there, in the judging of the judges, when the judges judged? And so you have a double judging, and Septuagint the Syriac doesn't have that. And so again, it's kind of two against one, and so that suggests that may be problematic. Then, if you assume that the Masoretic text is correct, well, how does that explain the other ones? Well, then you would say that, well, in the case of the Septuagint, it perhaps accidentally omitted the word days. In the case of the Syriac, it either had a text that lacked the word judging, the infinitive construct shafot. It either lacked that word shafot, the judging of the judges, It either lacked that word or they just thought it a little clumsy in the days of the judging of the judges, and so they paraphrased it a bit in the days of the judges to simplify. In other words, at the end of the day, it looks like the Masoretic text is most likely correct. And both the Septuagint represents omission of one word, and the Syriac represents simplifying an awkward sentence. And so it looks like that the Masoretic text, as is usually the case, looks like it's most likely the original one. So, in summary, the analysis of the texts and the versions show that the Hebrew Bible has been well preserved. The Masoretic tradition, which is everyone's used, is clearly the best tradition, and we can check it with the Samaritan Pentateuch. We can check it with the Dead Sea Scrolls. The versions come into play too, especially the Septuagint and the Vulgate and the Syriac and the Targums. And no major changes have taken place over the many centuries. And like the New Testament, we can say of the Old as well that the variants represent no major doctrine being changed. And we can thank the Lord that He has reliably preserved His Word.